We're going to record. And then I'm going to share my screen. Start. Okay. Let's see. So hopefully all of you are able to see my slideshow, and let me know, unmute yourselves and let me know if you don't see anything, but you should all be looking at two breeding northern gannets that are a little too close to comfort because their nests are so close, which is typically the case with these colonial breeders who nest right on top of one another pretty much. And this is actually one of the species that's currently being hit the hardest with this most recent strain of H5N1, which is that highly pathogenic avian influenza that seems to be just wreaking havoc on wild bird populations. This particular virus has been around for a while. I'll go through the history of it, and it to date has really impacted primarily domestic poultry stock through the years, with a small number of positive detections here and there in wild bird populations. But this go around, it seems as though it's really quite pervasive in terms of how it's impacting these wild birds. Just to give you a reference, when I was working on my doctorate back in 2006, I was sharing my lab with someone who was actually tracking highly pathogenic avian influenza, and most of her research was done in northern China and sampling water birds, primarily anseriforms or ducks and geese, which are known reservoirs for the virus. And the idea was that they would test birds in the wild and find kind of an early warning system for when they found them in wild goose populations, for example. They'd be able to sound the alarm before these geese spread out and did their nesting and migratory movements, so that we could try to head off the spread of the virus. And there wasn't much in terms of spread back then, but things are very, very different now. So let's talk about just how bad it's gotten. So these are the most recent numbers coming in from the National Wildlife Health Center. To date, there have been about 2,000 wild birds that have tested positive for the virus. Now, that number obviously is far lower than the actual number of wild birds that are carrying the virus and are probably suffering and dying from the virus without ever being seen by any testing center. So the number of wild birds that have been impacted is far higher than it ever has been before. And to date, roughly 40 million birds that are kept as poultry. So this is inclusive of chickens and turkeys and grouse and quail and other species that are commonly kept, bred, and then used for food. When you put that in comparison, the first time since 2015 that we have detected this in wild birds, and during the 2015 outbreak, only 98 wild birds tested positive for the virus. We had roughly 50 million poultry culled during the first outbreak, well, the most recent outbreak, I should say, in 2015, which was an estimated economic loss of roughly $3 billion. And we are far surpassing this with regards to wild birds and their contraction and carrying of the virus, and we are almost to the same numbers with regards to the poultry. This is what the 2014-2015 year outbreak looked like in terms of where it was found here in the United States. You can see that the vast majority of all cases were found right on that border in northern US, kind of the Midwest regions between the Central and Mississippi Flyway areas, and then a little bit on the West Coast as well. But by far, those darker red colors indicate higher losses. And so those dark red boxes are counties in which up to 8 million birds were detected as carrying the virus and culled as a result. So you can see how you can get 50 million in a relatively small geographic area when you think about just how many chickens we are producing in this country for human consumption. So this is what it looked like in 2014, 2015. This is what it looks like today. Vastly different, primarily due to the fact that there has been so much transmission within backyard bird flocks. So people like myself, I have backyard chickens here in Middletown. Some of you might have your own. It is seemingly making its way into just about every backyard population with ease should transmission be facilitated. So if these domestic birds are coming into contact with birds in the wild that carry the virus, such as corvids like blue jays or crows or ducks and geese, then they have a very easy time of contracting it. And so the latest word on the street is that backyard flocks, even the smallest backyard flocks, even if you have just a few birds, can actually get wiped out from this pretty easily if they just come into contact with it. The mortality rate is near 100% for poultry. But then also, and so you can see the commercial poultry here in red pretty much on track with what we saw in the 2014, 2015 in terms of the hot spots, right there in the Midwest United States, right in Iowa, which is seemingly where the bulk of all of the mortalities are occurring. But you can also see that it's spread well into the east here and then up into Canada. And the wild birds that are detected as positive cases for this virus extend all the way up into the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and all the way up into Newfoundland in Canada and all the way down the East Coast. So this is a growing problem, and unfortunately, it does not seem like it's going away. Again, this is just putting the same data into a different perspective, focusing just on the United States. This is actually slightly outdated because I obtained this image just a few days ago, and just a couple of days ago, we actually had our first confirmed wild bird case here in Rhode Island. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But up until then, we had not actually had any cases in our small state. Having that said, they have been getting quite a few backyard flocks testing positive in states that are bordering Rhode Island. So here are the counties that are affected throughout the United States of America, and you can see that it really is prevalent throughout that northern section of the country, which is mostly where most of the poultry are being produced. And then right here on the right-hand side, you can see that the most recent finding in Rhode Island is that we had a great blackback gull that was a wild bird that tested positive. It was a sickly bird that they found in Washington County. It wasn't yet dead. It was tested for the virus and it came back positive. Prior to that, we had actually been testing a number of dead seabirds and water birds that were found along the shores of Rhode Island, primarily shearwaters. And none of those birds actually ended up testing positive. So they perished for another reason, possibly starvation. So that this is just a very recent, this came out today. So this is a new news story about the one confirmed case here in Rhode Island. And this is a picture of one of the 15 dead shearwaters that was found on Second Beach here in Middletown, right down the road from where I live. And those shearwaters tested negative. They were all fairly emaciated, which leads us to believe that they expired due to starvation, which is a completely different topic to talk about when we talk about the issues of overfishing and climate change and how fish populations are moving around or being removed from the ocean in such a great to such a great degree that those fish are no longer available. Those forage fish are no longer available for these birds to forage on. So this is kind of just a breakdown of the 6 most heavily impacted species here in the state here in the country when we're talking about wild birds. And unfortunately, at the top of the list are bald eagles. So to date, we've had roughly 167 bald eagles die. and were tested and confirmed to have died from HPAI. Now that number, like I've said previously, is probably a lot greater than that because we're not finding all of these birds that are succumbing to the virus. There are plenty of bald eagles that live in relatively inaccessible locations that are likely suffering from the virus, that are perishing without ever being detected by any humans. So these all are numbers that are probably quite a bit lower than what is actually happening out in the environment. So bald eagles followed by mallards, 155 mallards, which is really kind of striking because mallards are known as a reservoir for this virus. And largely speaking, mallards don't generally have a high mortality to be a carrier of the virus, but they are not necessarily succumbing to the virus themselves. So they oftentimes serve as a point of transmission. And yet this go around, quite a few mallards have been dying from the virus. Canada goose, black vulture, turkey vultures too, but not nearly as many. Great horned owls, another one of our big apex raptor species, seems to be getting hit pretty hard. And quite obviously, with the case of great horned owls, they're very well maybe and likely are far more that are being impacted than just the ones that are being found by the public and tested, primarily just because of their cryptic habits. And then the red-tailed hawk, 80 mortalities thus far. So looking, transitioning to the poultry species, we have 382 confirmed flocks, which are 186 commercial flocks and 196 backyard flocks. And they are found throughout 36 different states, most recently detected in both Utah and Washington state. And like I said at the beginning, roughly 40 million of these chickens and turkeys have been euthanized as a result of testing positive for this virus. So let me just give you a quick primer of the virus itself, some history of the virus and how it mutates and what we know about it. There are 4 major types of influenza viruses, type A, B, C, and D. Type A is the one that we are talking about here. This is the one in which wild birds tend to be the primary reservoirs for the virus. They carry it, they transmit it, and in some instances, they suffer very high mortalities from it. There are 2 subtypes to all influenza A viruses, and this is based on the type of protein that they have on the surface of the virus itself. So if you'll remember from your high school biology or college biology course, just a quick refresher on how viruses work. They are small packets of genetic material that have proteins on the outside of them, and they attach to the cells inside of a living body based on the protein specificity of those cells. And then they are incorporated into the cell itself. And when that happens, they start replicating their own genetic material within that cell, taking over the cell, reproducing, causing lysis in some instances, which is the bursting of the cell, and then the virus spreads throughout the body of the organism. So based on what type of protein you have on the surface of that virus, the 2 big subtypes of influenza A viruses are HA, which is hemagglutinin, of which we have 18 known subtypes, and neuraminidase, which is 11 known subtypes within the influenza A viruses. The one we're talking about is H5N1, which just is basically, its nomenclature is stating that the 5th protein subtype of the hemagglutinin is present, and then the 1st protein subtype of that neuraminidase is present as well. All known influenza A viruses are known to affect birds with only 2 exceptions, and those 2 exceptions are found only in bats. Everything else can be carried by birds, can be transmitted by birds, but none of them seem to have this high pathogenic quality like H5N1 does. And viruses, as I'm sure you all know, because we've been dealing with our own pandemic for quite a while now, and you keep hearing about all these variants that keep popping up, because what happens is the virus gets into a living organism. Once it's in there and starts replicating and transmits from one human or one organism to another, it has a very high rate of mutation. And so once that happens, you can evolve very quick, distinct lineages of viruses due to geographic separation. For example, what is the virus that is found in one country ends up very rapidly evolving into something very different than what might be found in a separate country altogether. So there are two types of this avian influenza that we are concerned with. The one that we are overwhelmingly worried about is the HPAI, which is the highly pathogenic avian influenza. The low pathogenic avian influenza doesn't cause any sign of disease or mild disease. And I should note that, as this first bullet point states, the way that we test how virulent these viruses is their impact on captive chickens. And so when captive chickens are exposed to the low pathogenic avian influenza, it doesn't really seem to cause much in terms of disease, or if it does, the disease symptoms tend to be very mild and there isn't much of a mortality rate associated with it. The highly pathogenic avian influenza, however, does cause very high mortality, affecting many of the organ systems within an organism and causing mortality often within 48 hours of contracting the virus. Ducks, as I said earlier, are typically known to carry the virus without showing signs of illness. However, now we're seeing that quite a few ducks are in fact dying as a result of contracting H5N1. Human transmission is low. I should say that to date, I think there are 2 cases globally of human transmission where humans have contracted H5N1. And I think in both of those cases, and I'd have to double check to make sure that I'm right on this, are with individuals who are working in poultry farms and came into contact with sick birds. Something else that does happen is the low pathogenic avian influenza can change. It can mutate into a form of highly pathogenic avian influenza as it mutates its form within organisms as it passes from one organism to another. So viruses are a bit terrifying because they have this capability of mutating at a very high rate, and it's very difficult to keep track of it. I should say, because I don't have this on any of these slides, but I'm just thinking of it, that there are current vaccines that are being developed to treat poultry birds because the belief is that, much like we have vaccines for the coronavirus, we are likely capable of controlling this should we come up with the right forms of inoculant that we can use. There is no real good solution for inoculating wild birds at this stage, unfortunately. So wild birds that can contract the virus will unfortunately pass it from one bird to the next, and they can spread it over wide geographic areas. And simply put, we just don't have a way to combat that. And obviously going out and culling large populations of wild birds is certainly not going to be the right answer. So the origin of H5N1, it was first detected in 1996 in commercial goose farms in the Guangdong region of China. From there, it spilled over into wild birds, and it's been spreading globally ever since. So first it spread into Europe and Africa. Now it's found in North America. There's actually quite a bit of evidence to suggest that before long, it's going to be found in both South America and in Australia, just because of the species that are testing positive and their migratory movements and their capacity to spread the virus around. So it does seem like this is an absolute pandemic that these birds are facing, similar to our own, except in this case, mortality rates are quite dramatic and capable of wiping out really big subsets of wild bird populations. So the effects do seem to be different among wild species. The mallards traditionally are carriers that don't show signs of disease, but that's not necessarily the case right now. In the case of barnacle geese, 10% of the population of Norway, Norway's breeding barnacle geese population has already succumbed to this virus. Here in the States, we have a huge number of birds that are still out for testing. So the problem is testing lags behind detection. And so if we're finding sick and dying and dead birds, getting them tested is actually taking quite a while. And in the case of seabirds in particular, we're getting quite a few of them washing up on our shores that are dead. And not all of them are dead because of HPAI, but all of them are being tested for HPAI. And so we're still actually kind of behind the curve with regards to our data reporting. The likelihood is that the data spikes are going to continue to grow as we test more and more birds that are showing up dead. In Milwaukee, for example, it's been incredibly devastating for Caspian terns. Roughly 64-65% of the entire state's breeding population of Caspian tern, which is a really phenomenal species, have died thus far as a result of this highly pathogenic influenza strain. So in this particular example, here's a case in which this statewide bird population is going to be impacted extremely negatively, and over 1,500 of these Caspian terns have died to date as a result of this form of H5N1. The news stories are everywhere, so I'm sure that if you're keeping up with the news, you've read quite a few stories about all of these dead birds that are being found along the East Coast here and throughout the country, and really throughout North America. I think the estimates are well over 1 million domestic poultry birds have died thus far in Canada, and the number of wild birds that have been found, tested, and found to be positive for H5N1 in Canada is growing as well. This is an article that just came out yesterday. It's very doom and gloom because of just how bad the situation seems to be over in Europe, and it's absolutely true that at the moment Europe is kind of the epicenter for this in terms of how it's impacting wild bird populations. They have their own poultry farms over there, which kind of are a little less significant than the ones we have here, but their wild bird populations are suffering very, very, very heavily. So let me just give you some of those global statistics. The virus is found thus far, like I said, throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, likely to spread into South America and Australia. Over 3,000 poultry outbreaks globally, which has claimed the lives of 77 million birds. And our number of only 1,800 wild birds in the United States pales in comparison to the fact that they've had 2,600 wild bird outbreaks globally, representing roughly 400,000 individuals. And the big concern here is that this particular strain of H5N1 seems to be spreading more easily than any of the previous strains that we have had. And particular groups of birds seem to be exceptionally susceptible. So one of the big concerns for us are some of our endangered bird populations like piping plover, whooping crane. Whooping crane is cranes in general are known to get hit pretty hard by this. And so our whooping crane population, which is small, is definitely in danger of this virus. Talking specifically about some of those seabird colonies that have been hit so very hard in the North Atlantic. Lots of tern species, so sandwich terns, common terns, gulls. The biggest story that you may have read about are the northern gannets that have been impacted. This is very stark indeed. If you look on the left-hand side, this is April 2021 from Bass Rock. Bass Rock is the largest breeding colony of northern gannets on Earth. And it represents a pretty substantial percentage of the global population. So in that left-hand view, there are roughly 150,000 individuals breeding on Bass Rock, which if you're not familiar with Bass Rock, it's right off of the coast of Scotland. And on the right, you can see June of this year, the same view, and you can just see how few birds there are in comparison, roughly half. So almost half of the entire breeding population on Bass Rock, which is I would dare say maybe 25% of the global population at this point of northern gannets has been decimated as a result of the bird flu. So the bird flu in Scottish seabirds was first detected just last year. It was found in great squaw, which is another species of pelagic bird that very rarely comes to shore. And so with all of these birds, because they spend so much time out at sea, the only birds you're going to find and be able to test for are those that you find either floating at sea or washed up on the shoreline. So that's kind of where the primary concern lies. It's that a lot of these birds are dying at sea and not being detected, so the impact could actually be far larger than we are aware of. But the birds were first detected in the Shetland, Orkney, and St. Kilda Islands. 38% of the entire flyway population that uses Scotland of barnacle geese died last year from HPAI. And here are the numbers from Bass Rock. It's 56% of the entire global population. And like I said, they've already lost half of the numbers of gannets just this year. So just this breeding season, half or 25% of the entire global population of northern gannets has been completely wiped out. Very, very disheartening, primarily because of the natural history of these species. So let me just talk about that briefly in terms of why this is so impactful. If you put all birds on Earth onto a spectrum of reproductive biology, you would find that on one end, you have very small, short-lived birds. Think about things like chickadees or firecrests if you're in Europe, you know, or titmice. And these are birds that tend to live just a few years, and they reach sexual maturity very, very quickly. They reproduce lots and lots of babies in a single breeding season. So they will have multiple broods where they're pumping out 4 or 5 chicks with each brood. So their populations tend to be relatively large. Those chicks sexually mature very quickly, growing to an adult size within just a few weeks. Then within the next breeding season, they're ready to mate. So they're sexually mature at that stage. On the other end of that spectrum, you have what are called K-selected birds, and these are birds that tend to be very, very long-lived. So in the case of gannets, you can have birds that are living 15 to 20, even longer years in the wild. And so for birds that live such a long period, they tend to reach sexual maturity much longer. So birds in the Diometides family, such as the albatross, they tend to, you know, spend the first 5 to 8 years of their life at sea because they're not sexually mature. Once they reach sexual maturity, they have reproductive events that are timed either once a year or every other year, during which they only produce 1 or a maximum of 2 offspring per nesting attempt, and that's it. So every breeding season, they will produce 1 chick. And that 1 chick takes almost a full year in the case of things like albatross to actually leave the nest and become independent on its own. And then it takes that chick 5 to 8 to 9 years before it's sexually mature and able to breed on its own. So the lifetime reproductive success of a long-lived bird tends to be greater. So in the case of these birds that live 20 plus years, if they breed successfully every year and they only produce 1 or 2 offspring every year, they tend to produce more offspring over the course of their 25, 30-year lifespan than these little tiny chickadees do. They just spread that effort out over a longer period. So because of their reproductive constraints and because of their slow to mature natural history, they tend to have very small population sizes and very slow population growth rates. So northern gannets cannot bounce back very quickly from something like this. An event that wipes out a quarter of the entire population of a K-selected species is an event that can have lasting impacts. It could be on the order of decades before the northern gannet population is able to recover from something as serious as an H5N1 outbreak that kills such a substantial proportion of their population. And we still don't know when this outbreak of H5N1 is going to subside. And for all we know, this is just the start. And so far more gannets could actually end up dying before this thing is said and done. So what can you do? Unfortunately, you know, the best things you can do is you can try your best to avoid all direct contact with wild birds yourself, and also avoid feeding them when possible. I know that's a very tough pill to swallow because so many people derive so much enjoyment in life from watching birds visit their feeders, but bird feeders are collection points for birds. Wild birds are known reservoirs. The list of species that are known to carry, transmit, and suffer from this virus is growing. And so the birds that show up to your feeder very well could have the virus. transmit the virus at that feeding station. And it can also be a great way for that virus to make its way into domestic poultry flocks as well. So feeding birds is definitely discouraged at this stage, just until we have an idea of the breadth of the impact of this virus on wild bird populations, since numbers are just continuing to tick up and nothing really has leveled off yet. If you do have your own backyard bird flocks, or for some reason you come into contact with domestic poultry on a regular basis, do what you can to disinfect yourself afterwards so that you're not transmitting that virus. So if you go into a chicken coop and the chicken coop is full of chicken poop and you get it on your shoes and you walk through your yard, you're potentially going to have transmission between wild birds and those domestic poultry by doing so. So doing what you can to protect yourself and to minimize that transmission is definitely warranted in this case. Don't touch surfaces that might be contaminated. This is a virus that is contaminated through saliva and fecal matter. Okay, so these birds are contracting it from one another, particularly birds like gannets, which are all on this one rock breeding together, hundreds of thousands of birds, where there's just fecal matter and saliva everywhere. Obviously, transmission rates can be very, very high. If you have any suspected cases, you can report it to the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and they will either test the birds if they are able, or tell you if they don't think that it's much of cause for concern based on the species you've detected, the number of birds that you found dead. Unfortunately, they don't have an easy to give hyperlink. I can't tell you the website because it's very, very long to get to this page here, but this is the reporting page to use. If you go to a Google search and you just Google search RIDEM avian influenza, it'll take you to this page, and you can click on that big red button where you can fill out a form that has your name, your address, and then the observations you've had, and they will get back to you with prescriptions in terms of what they want you to do, whether they want you to collect the bird, whether they're going to send someone to collect the bird. It will really depend on the species of bird that you're reporting. You can also call them. They have a few numbers that you can use to call them, and I'll leave this slide up for just a few minutes in case you want to write these phone numbers down. If you have your own domestic poultry and any of those birds die, you would use the first two numbers seen here. So the 222-2781. However, if it's after hours, you can use 222, during regular business hours, you can try the 222-3070 number. And then if you find wild birds dead, you should be using that 7890281 number. So unfortunately, there's not a lot that can be done. We're all just kind of in this waiting pattern to see what happens. You know, it's still early, unfortunately, because it's only mid-July and there's still quite a bit of breeding activity going on in seabird populations around the world. So until those birds really break up and separate and go their separate ways and go through periods of migration into their non-breeding areas where they will spend a lot of time in isolation, foraging on the wing in the open ocean, they're going to be in these tight, compact colonies, and we're not going to see the end of transmission, I think, until they start spreading themselves out, which won't happen until late August, September. So it is extremely unfortunate. I'm going to go ahead and end my screen share here. So I'm sure that was very sobering to hear and see. It's incredibly sobering for me to have to sit and watch all these numbers roll in and not be able to do anything about it. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions, at least to the best of my ability, if you have any. Yeah, Barbara, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm sitting in for my daughter who has 6 baby birds, chickens. She just set up a whole thing in her house. So this is sobering, it's frightening as all get out, but what would you be looking for if a chicken were to contract this? Like how would it present in one of her chickens?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the primary indicators or symptoms are things like you can get swelling around the eyes, something similar to conjunctivitis, a lethargy. So if you see birds that are not moving around and sitting in one place for extended periods of time, muscle weakness in the neck and head. So if they can't keep their head up, that is an indication that they're sick with something. It's not necessarily this virus, but that is one of the symptoms of the virus. And like I said, unfortunately, this virus is so incredibly intense on the body that within 48 hours of contracting it, most birds will die from it. So, those are the primary symptoms, but by the time you see those symptoms, it's definitely too late, I would say, to do anything to help that bird. And by that time, it's probably already been transmitted to other birds in the flock. So unfortunately, I think the rule of thumb going forward with how USDA is approaching all of this is that, if they find a few sick birds in a giant flock, that entire flock needs to be culled to prevent the spread.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it really is. Sue? Hi, I can't hear you. I don't know why. You're not muted, but I'm not able to hear anything. Am I the only one?
Oh, I can't hear either.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is really a sad day for sure, but I always, trust your opinion, and I was really happy that you were doing this talk because I really needed some clarity and direction. And so as far as feeding the birds, that's my big dilemma. And I know the bird feeders should come down. It's recommended. Is that also like spreading food on the grass? That's not much better, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same principle. You'd be attracting birds into a small area where they're likely to come into contact with one another. So feeding events in general, feeding stations, putting seed out on the grass, putting feeders out, all of that tends to foster gregariousness in birds, and that is often how it's spread. So that unfortunately is something that could contribute to the spread of the virus, largely because it's been detected in so many species, to include things like blue jays, which very regularly will show up at bird feeders and interact with other birds. So it pains me to tell people that they shouldn't be feeding birds, because I know how much everyone loves to do so, but it is a known source of transmission.
Okay, and bird baths too.
Yeah. And what I've been telling people is that, I understand that some people just can't not feed birds. And if that's the case, just be very religious about cleaning your feeders, doing a very routine cleaning with a 10% bleach solution on a very regular basis. And that helps to clean the feeders out from whatever might be on them, to include not just HPAI, but other things that are easily transmissible among bird species, like avian conjunctivitis is a well-known illness that is oftentimes spread at bird feeders. So keeping your feeders very, very clean, if you can't avoid feeding them, is definitely.
Will you be able to kind of spread the word in this kind of way, or somehow on the Audubon when it's okay to put the feeders up again?
Yep. Yeah. So we've been trying to keep on top of this. I've posted 2 updates. I posted one early before the breeding season started with basic recommendations about stopping feeding and cleaning feeders. And then I just posted another update just a few weeks ago. But once we think that it's safe to resume feeding, I'll definitely post a new update, and I'll likely post more updates prior to that as well. As this continues to evolve, I'm trying my best to keep on top of it, and I want to disseminate as much of this information to our membership as possible. So when I know something new, I like to transmit it to you guys. So you can continue looking on our website for updates.
Okay, appreciate that. And just one more comment, like what is there any kind of responsibility for like places that are selling bird food to inform the public in some way about this?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think it's largely, there's nothing that can be due to enforce the idea of not feeding birds. It's really at your discretion whether or not you choose to. I just present the evidence and what we know, and then you have to take that information and use it to the best decision-making ability that you have. Having that said, I mean, I'm sure that some folks who have shops might be advertising that, that HPAI is a real threat, and, these are the steps you should take, and at least at the very minimum advertise that feeders should be cleaned on a regular basis. Actually, Suzanne, don't you own Wild Birds Unlimited? You could probably speak to this.
I manage the store. Yes. Well, we're always trying to encourage people to clean their feeders the most that they possibly can. Plus, not to have concentrations of all birds at one location. Of course, spreading feeders out and not having bird seed that goes on the ground and stays there, so that fecal matter builds up on the seed that the birds are going to eat. So yeah, we're trying to keep it. One of the reasons I'm joining here is to get an update on Rhode Island birds and try to pass the word. There are so many people who derive so much pleasure from feeding the birds, and right now it is their only source of pleasure because they're indoors and staying away from everything else. So it is very difficult, but we're absolutely trying to get people aware of cleanliness.
Yeah.
Absolute cleanliness when it comes to even after people are a little bit more aware of it after last year and the mystery illness that never came to Rhode Island. So there are some commercials well, not commercials, but infomercials on WCRI that we've been classical that we've been putting information into, and I'll be updating the lady who does the infomercials as well. So
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
certainly.
Charles,
Yes, sir.
do you see this? Here's my wren outside. He's very loud today. Do you think this will spread to smaller birds as well?
I think it's entirely possible. I think I think that the avian genotype is similar enough that if we're seeing it in species like blue jays, we could see it in thrushes, we could see it in small wrens and other birds as well. I don't know because I don't think that many of those species are being tested. I can tell you anecdotally that I'm getting called almost daily by folks in Rhode Island who are finding dead birds in their yard. There's nothing to say that those are all avian influenza cases. But someone called me today who found 5 robins dead in her yard of no apparent reason whatsoever. So, it's definitely something to be vigilant about because of the possibility of spread among all bird groups, and so one of the classic questions I receive when I say you should probably not feed birds until we know more about this is the first question is, what about hummingbirds? And yes, hummingbirds are also birds, and so unfortunately, it's not advisable at this time because not only hummingbirds use hummingbird feeders. My woodpeckers love to use my hummingbird feeders. Orioles love to use hummingbird feeders. And multiple individuals of ruby throats come and use my hummingbird feeder as well. So it's difficult to counsel folks not to feed birds because of just how much everyone loves to do it. But although it has not been detected in these small bird species, the likelihood of transmission is there, and so we have to just be cognizant of that. And right now, I mean, everybody's focusing really heavily on these seabirds because we just keep finding dead birds washing up on our shores, and what's happening in the North Atlantic right now with these breeding colonies of squaw and northern gannet is just absolutely terrifying.
I assume the virus is genetically mutating, just like COVID has done to us. And do you think the density of raising poultry in such tight barns, etc., is contributing to this problem?
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. I'm not a professional in poultry production, but what I can tell you is that this most recent outbreak has definitely prompted a tremendous amount of discussion about what mechanisms are in place to make sure that this kind of stuff doesn't happen. And so I think a whole slew of new regulations with regards to poultry production is going to come out of this. And it's all going to be geared towards lessening the rates of transmission. And so I do think that those high concentrations of birds is very clearly contributing to its rampant spread, particularly in these big poultry producing states. And something is going to need to be done moving forward to protect that industry, to make sure that they're not going to be creating issues of high mutation rates in these viruses if their flocks end up getting them. But again, I'm not a virologist, so there are people.
Yeah, be there in their own self-interest to try to get it under control. And they may lose money in the short run, but make it in the long run.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Where are gulls in this picture? Are they becoming infected or?
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, a number of species have tested positive. The one here in Rhode Island was a great blackback, and we know of other species that are testing positive. I don't know of any cases in which large scale mortality has been seen in gull populations, but it's certainly being found within a number of different gull species. So the likelihood is there for transmission.
So many herring gulls, and I've just recently had lost 3 of my 4 piping plover chicks to herring gulls. So it's like, keep the terns. Sorry, I don't want to be selective, but the piping plovers could use less herring gulls, but we don't want anybody to go out like this.
Yeah.
None of it.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific. If you really are interested in the macabre, there's plenty of videos being posted online from colonies that you can just watch these large scale mortalities, and you can see so many of these birds suffering, and it's heartbreaking to say the least. Barbara, did you have another question?
Yeah, but I pretty much know the answer. I have 3 bird baths that are actively used every day, robins, and I have multiple finch families in my backyard that, I'm so sad right now, but
Yeah.
I'm assuming we should close up shop on the bird baths.
Nothing collects bird poop better than a bird bath. They bathe and they poop, and that tends to then become in a liquid environment and very easily transmitted. So yeah, like you said, you already knew the answer to the question before you asked it. And unfortunately, I can confirm that bird baths, any collection point really is the concern. Anywhere where you're going to foster big collections of birds, big groups of birds coming together to forage or to bathe, tends to be a situation in which the virus has a heightened likelihood of being transmitted from one bird or one species to another.
Okay.
All right, so that's the latest. Again, I'm going to keep posting updates to our website. If it gets particularly bad that it warrants yet another town hall, I can certainly schedule one. And this has been recorded so that I can post it to our website, and hopefully the remaining folks who didn't make it this evening will be able to watch it and get kind of updated with the latest statistics, which unfortunately are just getting higher and higher every day, the numbers. So I will keep you all informed to the best of my ability. In the meantime, please do what you can to reduce transmission and look out for your own health and safety and the safety of the birds in your backyard. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your night now that I've totally bummed you all out.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you for
Thanks
the
a lot,
you.
information.
Charles.
Thank you,
Good to
Charles.
see you.
Yeah, you guys are all very welcome. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.